think you know Tarkov until the night teaches you that you don't. Because daytime in Tarkov is chaos you can understand, you can fathom. There's gunshots, shouts from scavs and other PMCs, footsteps, the usual language of violence. The first time you meet the cultists, Tarkov doesn't feel violent. It feels intentional. The air goes quiet, like the trees are listening. You sweep a flashlight through the tree line. Nothing. You pause. Still nothing. And then your PMC flinches like something grabbed their nerves. Not a gunshot. Not a grenade. A blade you never saw. And then the game drops a sentence on your screen that doesn't even sound like Tarkov. Unknown toxin. It's not poison. It's not infected. It's just unknown. Like even your body doesn't have a label for what just entered it. And that's the moment your raid stops being a shooter and becomes a countdown. Your loot stops mattering. Your guns don't mean anything. And your pride is shattered. And all you can think is, how far am I from safety? And how fast am I running out of time? You slam injectors. You gamble on meds. You start making ugly decisions. And if you survive that first encounter, you don't walk away thinking, cool, just a new enemy type. You walk away thinking, what the hell are those things? And why do they feel like they belong to the night more than I do? If you're into Tarkov lore told like a movie, subscribe. Because this isn't a wiki read. This is what the game teaches you through the way the cultists hunt, the places they mark, and the rituals you keep stumbling into. And here's the best part. Tarkov never explains the cultists directly. It makes you learn them the same way you learn everything else in this city, by surviving long enough to notice the pattern. Because once you've been hit with the toxin once, you start playing differently at night. You stop sprinting through open ground. You stop assuming silence means safety. You start checking shadows the way you check corners. And slowly, the game teaches you the first rule of cultists. They're not trying to win a fight. They're trying to complete an action. They don't announce themselves. They don't posture up like your typical bosses. They don't even seem interested in a fair gunfight. They close the distance like they're approaching something sacred. Like the kill isn't the point. Contact is. And that's why the poison matters so much. Because Tarkov could have made them scary in a normal way. Better armor, better aim, bigger guns. But Tarkov chose something intimate. A knife. Touch. A toxin that crawls under your health bar and starts rewriting your priorities. Which makes it feel less like a weapon, and more like a ritual. And when you start thinking of it like a ritual, you start noticing something else. The cultists aren't just in the dark. They're tied to the places that just feel wrong. Not dangerous wrong. Not this is a hot PvP area wrong. Wrong like someone is doing something here that isn't looting, isn't camping, isn't surviving. Wrong like the room is waiting for an audience. You find candles in buildings that don't have electricity. You find symbols in rooms where nobody should be comfortable enough to decorate. And you find the spaces that aren't messy like a place people fought in. They're arranged like a place people prepared. And Tarkov does this quietly. No quest marker screaming lore here. It just lets you walk in. And then you feel the temperature change. And when the second rule lands, the cultists don't just exist as enemies. They exist as a presence that leaves traces. And once you've seen enough traces, you start doing what Tarkov always turns you into. A paranoid detective. You You start asking questions that sound ridiculous until you've lived them. Why do these rooms repeat this vibe across different maps? Why does night feel claimed? And why does silence, well, feel planned? And eventually, Tarkov gives you the closest thing it ever gives to confirmation. Not a cutscene, an errand. A trader doesn't tell you, here's the cultist's origin story. They don't sit you down and explain the theology. They do something much more Tarkov than that. They point. They tell you to go out there and mark ritual sites. Not clear them. Not loot them. Not destroy them. Just mark them. Like the goal isn't to stop what's happening. It's to admit that it's happening. And that detail is huge for the story. Because it means the cultists aren't just a player rumour. They're a known phenomenon in Tarkov's world. People are tracking them the way you track a wildfire. Not because you think you can control it, but because you need proof it's spreading. And here's where the cultists go from creepy to deep. Because if all Tarkov showed you was knives, poison, and candles, you could still write them off as, alright, a horror faction. But the game keeps pushing one idea that changes everything. They have rules. And you learn that not when you're fighting them, but when you realise there are symbols that affect how they treat you. Because at some point you experience this weird shift. You move through the night, and it doesn't feel like you're being hunted the same way. You feel watched, but not targeted. And that's the most unsettling difference in the world. Because it suggests the cultists aren't just hunting. They're judging. They recognise something. Sign, status, a meaning. And once that clicks, the cultists stop being random killers at night. They become a faction with boundaries. And boundaries imply structure. And structure, well, that implies purpose. Which leads to the most dangerous thing Tarkov ever does with them. It doesn't just let you fear their rituals. It offers you a way to participate. You stand in your hideout, your once safe space in Tarkov, and you see it. A circle. An offering. You place valuables into it, not because the game forces you, but because curiosity and desperation are the two strongest currencies in Tarkov. You sacrifice value, and you wait. And later, something comes back in its place. And that is one of the biggest lore statements Tarkov makes without ever speaking. The cult isn't just surviving in the woods. It's operating. It's trading. And it's doing it through ritual language instead of normal economy. Which means the cultists aren't just out there. Their influence reaches your home. And the scariest part, you don't have to believe in them to use the circle. You just have to be desperate enough to try. So what does that make them really? Here's the meaning Tarkov keeps whispering. Tarkov has multiple wars happening at once. There's the loud war, PMCs, scavs, factions. But then there's the hidden war, consequences, cover-ups, contamination, whatever truly happened here. But the cultists represent a third war. The war for the human mind when the world collapses. Because when people lose their rules, they don't always become free. Sometimes they become obedient. They invent structure. They invent punishment. They invent ritual. And in a place like Tarkov, ritual can feel safer than the chaos. It gives you a reason, a pattern. That question answered, a why. Even if that why is dark. So when you zoom out, cultists don't feel like a gang. They feel like what happens when a city suffers long enough that people stop asking, how do we survive? And they start asking, what do we worship to make the fear make sense? I'll give you 3 interpretations. grounded in what the game shows you, and pick the one that hits hardest. Number 1. The cult formed around contamination and turned it into faith. To them, the toxin isn't a weapon. 2. Cult is a survival sect. The rituals are structure, the knife is enforcement, and the night is territory. And 3. Cult is organised, more than people want to admit, because symbols, recognition, offerings, those aren't tools of chaos. They're tools of a system. And the most Tarkov answer? All 3 can be true at the same time. So before the ending, tell me your theory in the comments. Experiment, religion, or organised system? And where was your first cultist encounter? Everyone's story sounds like a horror movie, because the final twist is this. The cultists don't just exist to scare you. They exist to change how you think about Tarkov. They turn the night into a territory with meaning, and they turn poison into identity. They turn candles into warnings. They turn your hideout into a place where you can trade with the dark. And that's why they're so effective. They're the moment Tarkov stops being only a shooter and becomes a story about what humans become when the world stops making sense. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If the cultists are what happens when people stop believing in laws, what does that make us? Survivors? Looters? Or just the next people who'll sacrifice anything for the illusion of control?